Welcome to Word on the Block, the series that takes a deeper dive into blockchain and the emerging technology stories that shape our world at the intersection of business, economy, and politics. It's what we cover right here on Forecast News. I'm Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Well, there's a debate raging, and it's all about decentralization, and it centers around how easy it is for nodes to essentially be validated, distributed around the world. And so is it proof of work or proof of stake? So what am I talking about here? Proof of work takes a lot of work. It essentially takes a look at the entire blockchain, validates it before passing it along to the next node. And the idea is that it is immutable, everything is validated, and there is nothing untoward. The problem is the latency rate, the transaction per second. And so how technology has advanced is now proof of stake, where you just take a sliver of that information, potentially the most important part, something predetermined. You validate that before then passing it along. It's probably a very poor layman's description of what's happening in technology. So I'm going to bring in really the expert here to talk about the future of decentralization, whether or not it's a myth, with Konstantin Richter. He is co-founder, or founder rather, CEO of Blockdaemon. This is a node infrastructure company. And so I'll let you, Konstantin, explain exactly what Blockdaemon does before we talk about all of this, nodes, distribution, and decentralization. Konstantin, welcome.
Thank you so much, and it's great being here. Yeah, you know, you kind of described it in a really interesting way. I think the way, so yes, I'm the CEO and founder of Blockdaemon. Blockdaemon is an infrastructure as a service company in the blockchain space. And one way to describe it is when people talk about decentralized ledger technology, blockchains, really the core component lies in the decentralized. You know, there's a lot of ledger technology you can use left, right, and center. It's that combination that makes it special. And decentralization is the actual location of the server that runs the software that validates the physical blockchain. And so what you want is, and that's what we call a node, is the server with the software and then a connection to other nodes in the network, and that constitutes a node. And all blockchains have these different nodes, and ideally there's a sufficient amount of nodes in a network so that not any individual person who has a server and the software can jeopardize or impact the information that is shared that each of these nodes physically stores. And so and we help really manage that complexity of operating these nodes for institutional customers specifically. So these nodes are complex because they are distributed and decentralized, which means there's a lot of network participants that don't know each other that use open source components of software. And when you have open source communities like on Ethereum or Bitcoin, for example, which are proof of work chains for the time being, the code evolution is very non-linear. And so to keep the code fresh on your node, you need to be involved in the community. You need to know what's up. It's not like, you can't just sort of buy something off the shelf that's enterprise grade. And so we're bridging that open source chaos, decentralization for institutional customers who are like, listen, I want to participate in this network. The node needs to be up and active and updated all the time. So it's like, I want zero downtime. I want this to be easily accessible to me, and I don't ever want to worry about it because it gets complicated if you need to do it yourself. And so we do that.
Yeah.
And that's what it means to be a node infrastructure company in this.
It's almost as if you're professionalizing, and it must. I mean, we are using this technology in many, many facets, and there demands an enterprise grade professionalism to nodes. But, to your point, Bitcoin, the grandfather of them all, really started as a community, open source. And so it was really fueled by the interests of one that spread to many. And obviously when it's more about a community and you're talking about society, there's different variances of participation. Somebody could be casual, spend a few hours of a day or, few minutes versus all the way up to completely professional. This is a full-time thing. And so the varying degree is what that inconsistency is almost unacceptable. So it sounds like you're really professionalizing it at a level of enterprise grade so that people can depend on it, expect it, trust it, that there's a consistency there.
Correct. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And so one way when I started the company was thinking, how do we bring professional cloud formation tooling? So that it gets a little software-y, but the last big data revolution for companies and institutions was the cloud evolution, which is moving data outside of your own protected data center into shared infrastructure that Amazon or whoever else might own. And so this is now the next evolution of that, which means that enterprises are now to a degree comfortable with their data being stored by another provider, but now they need to trust and learn that it's actually okay if the data not just lives in the data center that you actually have a partnership with, but on all the different servers in an open source decentralized system. So it's kind of a cloud times 100. Right. And so it's
this is the excitement. Yeah, this is the excitement that we're seeing for IPFS and for Filecoin ahead of their mainnet. This is the infrastructure of Web 3.0. So, it's interesting to talk to you because you're essentially, you see the landscape. You see, especially with 30 protocols and helping manage the node infrastructure, there's almost a contradiction in terms happening at the moment, and we've seen this in this space, and this has only grown in intensity. So let me start with the 51% attack. Once upon a time, this was very theoretical. Once upon a time, it was thought that if the nodes distributed around the world, how could it be physically or even economically feasible to take over 51% of the nodes to then dominate the rest of the system, right? But we've seen that this year, past few months. We spoke to ETC Lab CEO Terry Culver. They've been the target of not one, but three 51% attacks, as that team, Ethereum Classic, insists on proof of work. And so therein lies the problem. And then we are also very much aware that for many of the miners, there seems to be obviously in, only specific geographical locations on Earth where, electricity rates are low and mining costs are low. And so there is an overabundance of miners. And so there seems to be a dominance of nodes there. So what's really happening in blockchain today? Is decentralization truly a reality, or is it unrealistic?
Yeah, so first of all, decentralization is an absolute that can never really fully be achieved, right? And so it's a little bit like, when you play the game of like, where do you live? I live in this number, in this street, in this town, in this country, on this planet, in this universe, in this, there's always one larger layer, and the same is true for decentralization. So, and what that means is that there's degrees of decentralization that you can live with at a certain moment in time. And so what I would say, the first and foremost important degree of decentralization is, do you have sufficient distribution that an attack or somebody jeopardizing the network is highly unlikely, not impossible, because impossible is very hard to achieve, but on certain networks, the attack is an important factor, obviously, because that's how you bring trust to it. No enterprise will put very substantial data into a public chain if there's any sense that the data could be corrupted, for example. And so I would say at this moment in time, there's no chain that really guarantees that's open to the public. Like even Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ethereum Classic, obviously for different reasons. They're all theoretically decentralized to a degree, but they have exactly the problem that you've mentioned, which is certain countries where mining has very particular advantages. There's large corporations. There's probably 3 or 4 miners in the world that have enough hash rate to in theory, corrupt the chain, right? Now, the fun part is that's just one part of decentralization. There's also the economical part, because the reason is obviously there needs to be, why would anyone do it? The miners actually have no interest in doing it because they would kill their business. Because the second you do it, you kind of have a sort of nano minute in which you can extract value, and then the whole thing shuts down and it's over, right? And so, so it's a combination of sort of technical ability as well as economical incentive mechanisms, right? And so, and that's where Ethereum Classic, for example, was a fairly unique proposition, also in terms of volume and participants in the market, where something like that could be valuable. For a larger network like Bitcoin, that's highly unlikely that anyone would do that, because that mining firm would put itself out of business. So they better be able to steal enough Bitcoin to make sure that they never ever, can live with never ever participating in a decentralized network again. And so,
I mean, you've seen it all. So what are best practices? You've highlighted a lot of vulnerabilities, but what are the best practices, and are they being practiced right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all learning, and it's still very early days. And so I think one of the most important challenges and best practices is, and where we struggle, is educate speculative stakeholders who hold too many tokens to use these tokens for the benefit of the network, which is not put it all on one node with the lowest fees possible, so you suck out as much value as you can. Maybe you should run multiple different nodes in multiple locations with multiple different providers. Give the network some latency and performance, and don't just see yourself as, I just hold these tokens, I want the highest yield possible, and I don't care about the structure of this network. And I think, so that's one best practice that we've now seen, is that smart projects start having that discussion with their respective investors, as well as potentially with exchanges and custodians, which is like, we appreciate you giving us liquidity, but you have to be careful that, because you're such a big exchange, you don't end up with 30 or 40% of the market in one bucket. And then we need to know how that bucket is secured. We need to make sure, it's not in the interest of the physical protocol to have that much centralization on an asset like that. And so, it's really a debate around, with all these different stakeholders who in theory hold a lot of power and need to constantly give some away. And as you know, when economic incentives, specifically in crypto, are very high, and it's very hard to find investors who respect projects to do that. And so I think one of the reasons why I'm excited about a lot of the newer projects is because a lot of the older projects, for example, weren't very wise. Let's talk about Ethereum Classic here as an example. There's a lot of bag holders and stakeholders in the network who are maybe not as interested in bringing the network to life. They're more interested in, can I just get my money out? Or is there other ways that I can extract value out of this network? And so getting really smart in whose money you take and how you manage the token market without jeopardizing the market, and so what are the strategies on managing that type of liquidity, making sure you have multiple exchange relationships, making sure you have smart market makers and all that type of stuff. Working with custodians, I think we're just learning as a facilitator in that arena what that can mean for a network, because if the problem is that a lot of the economical models for companies like us, we're venture backed, right, is always a little bit of marketplace zero-sum game. And I'm always trying to tell my competitors and people when I talk to investors, and they're like, well, you got to be the only one. And like, it's like, if I'm the only node operator in the world, we have no blockchain. Like, that's not how this works. And so, how do you create win-win mentalities in these open source networks in order to protect the networks as well as have healthy competition? That's sort of kind of where I think best practice questions lie at this very moment.
Yeah.
Like, how do we ask these questions? How do we respond to those? How do we adjust economical models to reflect that over time? But I'd say on each network, we're still very challenged. Absolutely.
It's a great point, because technology and the promise of blockchain was always that it would almost bake in these democratic best principles and first principles, governance, community, all of that. And then in practicality, as we've seen this industry evolve, all of the vulnerabilities of people essentially wanting to dominate because the economic incentives are so high. And so then comes along, organizations like Libra, where you have like-minded, liked interest, common interest coming together. And that's for sure a controversial example, but it's an evolution of an attempt to create governance over an economic model, a new economic model. What do you think about that as part of the evolution? We are seeing more and more of that. We are seeing more sovereigns. We are seeing more nations in play with central bank-backed digital currencies, for example. We are seeing organizations and Fortune 50s like MasterCard coming in and trying to create an ecosystem in which CBDC can be tested and grown. How, as enterprise evolves to more institutional and legacy evolutions of this technology, is that part of the answer, or?
Sure. Yeah, I believe so. I mean, and so first, Libra is a good example. I'm going to say something fairly controversial. Like, I really like how certain components of Libra, and so I think it's very smart to the way they've gone about it, which is ultimately we want participants who pay to be in this association because they believe in the vision of this association to have an equal share of ownership and say. And if you do that across 100, you probably have a fairly decentralized network. Like if there's 100 individual stakeholders who all have the same vote, that seems to be a working system to me. Because the biggest problem in even the large open source POS systems where they have 100 validators, which is mostly the max number of validators in the network, that you can operate a payment-like network without having too much problems on the performance side. You probably have the first 10 nodes, and most of these networks have more than 50% of the network. And so, when the blockchain folks scream out about Libra, it's like, there's projects I love, but it's like you look at the validator list and it's like, yeah, after 10 nodes, it's like, they have 50% of the market. And so Libra's setup of like, we're going to pick 100 entities makes a lot of sense. And so we actually work with a lot of projects where we try to educate them when we run nodes. So for example, we have a university program. We always recommend that each network has up to 20% of the nodes devoted to academia and research, which are entities that aren't necessarily just motivated by financial gains. And so that you have kind of sort of balances and checks in place. So you have non-for-profits, you have academia and universities, you have people who would use the payment mechanism, for example. You have people who enabling the liquidity, like exchanges and custodians who should own nodes. And then you have operators like us who should own nodes because they can back up the network really quickly, for example. And so I think that's a smart way of doing it in the absence of a market dynamic that actually supports true decentralization. And so I like how Libra did it.
Yeah, and I'm really hearing this description that it's almost like what you're trying to create is, in terms of the integrity of the network, it must reflect society. So right. it can't just reflect the whales. It can't just reflect self-interested, enterprises. It must kind of reflect the diversity of our Earth ecosystem, essentially, our economic model, where you have different participants. I mean, ultimately, that would be the healthiest, the healthiest network of all.
And we should learn from, governance is a great example, because obviously, I'm based in the US and we have great examples of existing governance models that were tested for hundreds of years. And so it's also like sometimes the disruption is in the combination of ingredients. We should look at best practices and see, how does a government, how does the Senate in the US handle this diversity of states and people and all that type of stuff? And yes, there's a lot of bad things to say about it, but you will have that in any community aspect. I think the one thing we all agree is that if money is the driver of that, it tends to have bad outcome. And so, and we see that in our political current environment. And so that to me, is the principal challenge, because when I talk to kind of sort of crypto cypherpunks, a lot of the times there's this expectation that these value systems will replace these existing payment systems and be fairer or more mutually beneficial. And we currently have not seen that, just to be very clear. Like, we're not even remotely there. And you know, it's so complex how to build, like, imagine like how to build good governance. You know, it's not like some kids, and I don't mean this to sound demeaning, but it's not like you know, we write a 10-page white paper and figure it out and the free market will take care of everything. Like, it's a little naive, you know, and I think blockchain deserves better. And so our view is that we need these existing governments and institutions to participate in these systems in order to bring, you know, blockchain to a wider audience, which is the raison d'etre for BlockDamon, is that we allow these type of institutions, governments, Fortune 500s, banks, easy, reliable access to these networks. And so for us, this is a stepping stone, is we need to work with these entities. We can't just build a parallel universe and then hope that to be you know, fairer than what we currently have. You know, the existing systems of governance, if you like democracy and stuff, like, it took hundreds of years to build, you know. I think it's naive to assume that, you know, that we can just sort of come up with something very simplistic. Like, you know, it requires dialogue and participation. And so that's really where we see it. And so we actively seek the conversation with those entities to come and start participating in these networks, start investigating how consensus works and how can they participate in a network, what's safe, what's not safe. And so it's super important to also know how early we are. We're really just starting this journey, you know, and so it's important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And in fact, BlockDamon is also starting your journey with a recent funding raise of $5.5 million. How were you able to do this during COVID? Before I let you go, I got to hear about your plans expanding into Europe and right here in Asia, where I am.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we've raised around 10 million bucks to date. The latest round was in March, and we were kind of unfortunate. We were actually, you know, we were preparing larger financial sort of moves, and then COVID happened, and then we thought, you know what, let's just, you know, go small with a selected group of investors we like, a lot of them based in Asia, which is a territory we're planning to be very active in. And so we got lucky that we have very seasoned enterprise-grade investors in Comcast and a few other larger guys who all came into this round and said, listen, you know, we have a long-term view on what you do. So we didn't have nervous sort of hands in the mix, and really just wanted to set us up. I mean, the company, we've seen tenfold growth over the last, I'd say, 18 months as a business. And so we've been built to be a real software company ultimately. So we're looking very healthy and good as a software business in this space. And so we've had a relatively, I want to touch wood, easy time of it. I think what we're experiencing now is very rapid growth. We're, you know, powering and providing infrastructure for most of the new big networks you hear about that launch left, right, and center. And we're obviously very keen to extend our services into Asia. We have customers and partners there. Investors are like Hashkey, Fenbushi, Kinetic Capital. For example, we run nodes and manage tokens for all those different entities. And we're also actively looking for deeper protocol-centric partnerships with projects like Terra, for example, that we really like. And so there's different projects out there. Personally, I think it's probably the largest opportunity in market. I think the Asian ecosystem blockchain ecosystem is outstanding. You know, convergence of a lot of excellent things, like amazing engineers, an amazing, I don't know, desire to try new things. You know, adoption rates like in countries like Korea are enormous. And so I think it's definitely a market I'm super keen on. And, you know, we're making moves sort of by, you know, partnering with more investors. So what's interesting for companies like us, we're still early and small in a way. And so when we bring in investors, we're looking for investors who can help us expand in this region. And that's certainly been true for us with our investor base. And the current next step for us is to bring in some local hires as well in terms of helping us to grow the business, like have really feet on the ground, not that anywhere can go anywhere, but people who really have deep knowledge in the market. That's key for us. I'd say the last thing in terms of strategy, the way we always thought is we always started with a node, and we're currently at a stage where we run nodes for foundations and large stakeholders, which is the sort of staking environment. And then we now run infrastructure for the next level of the onion or something, the layer, which is exchanges and custodians to facilitate the trade of the tokens and make it easy for people to connect to the network. And I think for us, the next third layer is actually going to be connecting all these protocols to each other. And so to kind of build the bridges that also all these different protocols to work in parallel. And so I think we're very—
So you're talking about interoperability. You're going to be in the layer 2.
Well, kind of what we're saying is when BlockDamon is a platform, and so we onboard these protocols onto our platform and allow people to easily kind of, if you think about it, incubate a new node with a click of a button to participate in a network. And so there's other technical connectivity there. And so one layer is as well that when we have a protocol on our stack, we make it extra easy to connect it to other protocols on our stack.
Got it.
Our tech stack is built in a way that these protocols can very easily bridge to each other, right? And
platform hegemony. You're trying to create platform hegemony, essentially.
That's right. And so that's sort of kind of, I think we're heading most in 2021 to kind of enable that degree of liquidity, and also think about like how do on and off ramps look to these protocols from a liquidity perspective. How can we dip our feet in there and look at how that, how volume transaction fees are starting to come into play, which is currently still very low, and build a business around that. So yeah, so we're excited.
Tell us about then that BlockDamon is integrating with Blockstack testnet Stack 2.0. Talk about how is that part of the strategy there, and what are the key factors there?
Yeah, it's a great example. So the way we like to partner with great projects like Blockstack is, so we bring the required developer tooling to them for the degree of maturity of their network. Now, what that means is we partner with someone like Blockstack and help them very early building the testnet and the infrastructure that they are preparing for their POS launch, which is they have a token. And as you know, when you move to mainnet, what you're essentially doing is you're onboarding your largest investors to run nodes on the network, which is a POS network. It means you launch, let's say 100 nodes, and you want people to delegate tokens to it. And those are the investors. And so you need to enable and facilitate the building of these nodes. And our platform automates that. So it lowers the barrier of entry for investors and individuals to participate in running a validator. Now, there aren't a lot of validators. So that's a fairly white glove service where we might run 10 or so of 100, and we might do that for an exchange and a custodian, 3 investors, our own validator for BlockDamon. And so we platform it. And then with Blockstack, what's unique is that we've also, in our relationship already, covered all the other layers of the onion. And so the next layer is full node deployment tooling for exchanges and custodians. And then the layer after that is an API that people can connect to. And then the layer after that is actually on-prem tooling where people can download scripts and actually manage their own nodes with tooling. And so we cover the project will start with the first part, which is a testnet we build, and then we onboard the investors. Then we're going to help exchanges and custodians over time to migrate and support the token. And then in the long run, we're going to support developers building applications on top of it. And so it's a very full suite of service. And we just tick a box of like, we need to make sure we have professional developer tooling so all these different stakeholders can come to the network at their time when it's ready and beneficial for them. And so we're just a tick in that box and making sure that, hey, there's companies here that are ISO compliant. ISO is a large security standard. We get externally audited on our technology, as well as our, when I talked about one of the biggest risks being the individuals, like we all get background checked, we have external audits, all that type of stuff done on anyone who joins us. And so, we bring investors and institutions a degree of security to easily interact with the system. And sort of that's kind of what we do for these networks. And Blockstack has been probably one of the smartest projects actually in the landscape for a while. And they very clearly saw the need for something like that. We started obviously speaking to them a month ago to say, hey, we we need to put in certain stakes. Yes, we want this to be a vibrant open network, but we also want tooling and everything else so we can jumpstart certain components of this network if we need to.
So, it brings us back to, the reason why we kind of started this conversation in the first place. When you have hegemony or technical dominance, you almost start to behave like, a central organization. And so is then truly, as, this industry evolves, as blockchain evolves in the next decade to come, decentralization, what realistically is that achievable? Or even in the way you function, the more successful you are, the less decentralized everything else is.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And obviously that's one we've tackled right away. And we get asked this all the time, which is absolutely true. What happens if we're, because we run a large percentage of the world's nodes, for example, become a single point of failure? And there's really two components. One is the systemic nature of our own architecture and how we handle the complexity and insurances of that. As I said, you have to worry about different components of your decentralization at specific moments in time. And so our setup is relevant for a specific moment in time. And then the true long tail story of where we're going and where we hope blockchain is going is the last part I've mentioned around Blockstack, helping individual developers to run their own nodes, which is actually contributing open source tooling where people can, the deployment scripts we built internally very early on to launch these nodes, for example, we open source them over time. And then what we're monetizing is the ability to monitor them. But that means that, for example, people can run the nodes in their own cloud and we can't touch them anymore. And so moving people from the clouds that we manage, which is, we have clouds of Azure, Amazon, Google, we work with all of them, Tencent, but then allow people to use BlockDamon tooling to deploy and manage their own node that we can't touch, which means I can't.
I get it.
And so,
I get it. It's like you're the builder and the architect right now, but at some point you'll pass along the blueprint and then people can build their own house.
And it'll be reflected economically as well, because the long-term business model on that side of the business is actually having people pay us $5 a month for alerting on their node. Where it's much more like, hey, you need to do an update, and hey, your node might be a little like you might have to download a new script, click this button. And so there's services here, a lot more like Red Hat probably, or Datadog type of company. But and we have those tools now. And so a lot of these projects actually already pay us to build these on-prem, is what's that called. It's like, so people can use components of what we offer in their own cloud. And so we already support that. And so it's not just a lip service, we're actually development there. And so I do think that actually a lot of the functioning networks will be like Libra, where there are rules and contracts and stipulations and a community of nodes that will manage that. And so, and so we'll fall into a bracket like that, where we'll be one of them one day, and we'll participate that way. But I think we still haven't found the way to provide a decentralization of node. One thing before I end, what people forget is, the problem is that this technology is complicated. A lot of companies, and us included, for certain projects use Docker images to launch nodes. Docker has known security flaws. Like, there's a lot of open source software that's used by people building, and a lot of those have flaws too on the security side. So you're never going to have 100%. And so risk mitigation and planning around, what are disaster recovery plans, all that type of stuff is really what you want to look for, which again is one of the reasons why people come to BlockDamon, because we have that, right? Like, so we have all these different theoretical plans and processes to handle potential issues. And it's just a question of time until they arise,
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great point. Diversity is a safety feature. And we know this in society, we know this about knowledge, and we absolutely know this for blockchain. Konstantin, what a pleasure it was. Thank you so much for your deeper insight and a glimpse into this world and giving us a little bit more clarity here. It was great to have you on the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you everyone for joining us on this latest episode of Word on the Block. I'm Forecast News Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Until the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Konstantin.
Bye.
I really like that one. I hope you did too. That's what we do at Forecast News. I'm Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Click like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. And here's the next one.